Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Jacob McCarty, and I am a sophomore studying political science, public administration, and leadership studies here at KU. This is my second year on the Student Advisory Board and my first as a discussion group coordinator. I have enjoyed my time here at the Dole Institute and on the Student Advisory Board. One of the special opportunities I have been able to participate in due to the Dole Institute was a policy writing challenge with other Institute of Politics throughout the country. Our team ended up winning after being judged by former Congressman John Tester in Chicago. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs, networking with our special guests, and professional development opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join the Student Advisory Board, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussions around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your question with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now please join me in welcoming Dole Fellow Matt Beat.
Thank you, and thank you to the Dole Institute and everybody here for helping put this together. It's been a lot of fun. This is the fifth and final program of the series called Exactly How Much Power Does an American President Have? And this is something that, fortunately for me, has been on the top of mind for many Americans anyway. So the timing was pretty good, although it's, for many, understandably a scary time to live through. So hopefully you can walk away today with more knowledge, which means less fear often. So I wrote out an introduction here. I'm going to make sure I stick to it so I don't stumble over my words this time, okay? So bear with me. Okay. Sure, the United States is a republic, but it's also a representative democracy. And the one person who represents us at the federal level, the one person that represents the entire country to the rest of the world, more than any other person, is, yes, the President of the United States of America. Today, we focus on the relationship the president has with their bosses, also called the voters, us. We, the voters, we hire and we fire. As citizens, we are supposed to have the final say regarding who the president is and how they govern. But we don't live in a pure democracy, do we? We live in a democratic republic. That means that just as our federal government's powers are limited, so are the voting powers of American citizens. In presidential elections, the Electoral College establishes a barrier between us and who wins the presidency. The person who wins the presidency doesn't necessarily get the most votes, and especially not the majority of the vote. Heck, if a candidate doesn't get a majority of electoral votes, then it's not even up to us. It's up to the House of Representatives to pick the president. How about that? And that actually happened one time, 1824. Yeah, I wasn't there, but I heard about it, yeah. But there have been a total of 60 presidential elections in American history now, and 5 of those, 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and most recently 2016, the candidate who won the popular vote lost the Electoral College and therefore lost the election. So it didn't matter that they had won the most votes. That's 8%, 8% of all elections. But the Electoral College aside, many Americans also view the fact that presidential elections are determined by plurality voting as a bad thing. And we're going to get more into this later, but plurality voting is just when a citizen only gets to vote for one candidate, and the candidate who gets the most votes, also known as a plurality, wins the election. So even if they don't get the majority of votes, and this is a crazy stat that I found, and when we say majority, we're just meaning more than 50%. There have been 60 presidential elections in American history, and in 20 of those, or 1 out of every 3 presidential elections, the winner of the election only won a plurality of the vote, not a majority. Most famously, Abraham Lincoln. And that kind of caused a little war that happened after that. I should say, though, that plurality voting, even though it's something that many people don't like, it's still the most common way we do elections in the United States, not just at the federal level, but at every level of government. Often plurality voting makes it seem that we only have 2 choices, and we are choosing the lesser of the 2 evils. You probably heard that phrase before. It increases polarization, and most importantly, it decreases true representation. And you're going to hear that word a lot today, representation. So I should probably, I'm not going to get off script too much here, but I tend to joke around that I have boring political opinions. Like whenever I share my political opinions, they're kind of boring. And what I mean by that is that I would say 70 to 90% of Americans agree with where I stand on most political issues. Yeah, I'm a normie, okay, whatever. But let me give you an example of this, okay? I'm going to give you 3 examples. I looked up some opinion polls. You want numbers? One poll showed that 70% of American adults want Medicare for all. 70%, and I agree with that, okay? That's not a controversial opinion. Another poll showed that 88% of American adults want legal cannabis for either medical or recreational use. 88%. Yet another poll showed that 83% of American adults want term limits for members of Congress. And here's the most shocking poll of them all. 94% of those polled in one poll support universal background checks for all gun sales. And yet, we don't have any of those things, do we? All 4 of those things that are extremely popular with the majority of Americans, we do not have. And so that's the whole point of today. It's so crazy that it seems like I'm making this up, but it's 100% true. Our representative democracy is not that representative. Things are broken. So we come with good news. Things are changing. Alternative voting methods are gaining traction. Alternative voting methods like ranked choice voting, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, but also approval voting, score voting, and my personal favorite, star voting. There are also rising movements to change the way we as Americans are represented. Why do we have single-member districts for members of the House of Representatives? Why are those districts drawn up so weirdly? You know, this thing called gerrymandering. Why do we only have 435 members of the House of Representatives? It's been that way since 1929. Why? Why not have proportional representation instead? As it turns out, another way to reform how we vote for the president might just be reforming how we vote for members of Congress. So there's a twist. While we may disagree with voting reforms, one thing is for sure. Presidential elections are nasty, they're divisive, they're polarizing. Often Americans, again, we feel like we're choosing the lesser of 2 evils. And it's the most polarizing candidates that get to the top. Not having a presidential candidate we believe in causes many of us to not even participate in the process at all. In today's program, let's analyze the different proposed reforms to make the process of how to pick the president less controversial. However, I must say that I hope you leave today realizing that any reform would probably make our wonderful country less divided and happier with the way we pick our president. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our special guests, which, in case you hadn't noticed, there's not 1, but 2 special guests up here. I know that you're pretty good at math. I figured you figured it out. Okay, first of all, we've got Sara Wolk here. She is the executive director of the Equal Vote Coalition, a nonprofit fighting for true equality in the vote itself. Her background spans from the sustainable agriculture and architecture fields to participating on an ecological survey project to protect Ecuador's cloud forests that helped cement an international judicial precedent on the rights of nature. Today, she is a peer-reviewed author, speaker, researcher, content creator, and organizer focused on teaching people about voting methods and the way they shape our society. Let's give a warm welcome for Sara Wolk.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. All the way from Oregon, by the way. And to her left is Walter Clapp. He is an attorney and speaker who received his law degree from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It's kind of a big deal, yeah. Where he clerked for both the U.S. House and Senate before turning to private practice. While in the House, Walter focused on oversight of the executive branch. While in the Senate, Walter was tasked with researching the history of the size of the U.S. House of Representatives. He now runs the No Cap Fund, a 501c4 dedicated to uncapping the U.S. House and restoring trust in federal institutions in this age of artificial intelligence. Let's welcome Walter Clapp.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. It always boosts your ego when you got a room full of people putting their hands together for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, now you're confident. Let's get rolling. With my first question to both of you is, what is the best way to reform how we elect a president?
So voting reform is a big puzzle, and there are a lot of important components. At the Equal Vote Coalition, our thesis is really that the weight and worth of every citizen's vote should be equal, as nearly as is practicable. And I just quoted the Supreme Court with that one. That is actually the legal definition of one person, one vote. The weight and worth of every citizen's vote should be equal. And there are a lot of ways that our votes currently are not equal. Just the right to vote itself was really the first step, so the voting rights movement is something that we actively need to be working on. And our piece of the puzzle starts with the foundation, how we fill out our ballots and how we vote ourselves, how we vote itself. So most of us are familiar with choose one voting, plurality voting, it's sometimes called, where you mark one candidate only. But that can put a voter at a serious disadvantage if there are multiple options. So it works perfectly if there's two candidates only, but if there are three or more candidates, whichever side runs more candidates runs the risk of splitting the vote and ending up essentially divided and conquered. So what we're looking at is voting methods where even with 3, 4, 5 candidates, 5 parties on the ballot, we're able to vote our conscience and ensure the equality of the weight of our vote. So if the election was tied before I voted and I cast my ballot, it should be tied again. So we propose a number of methods, but our favorite and our flagship is star voting. So with star voting, you're able to score your candidates from 0 up to 5 stars. 5 stars best, 0 stars worst. And that 5-star ballot, it's not only familiar, obviously millions of us have rated things 0 to 5 all around the world, but it lets us show our preference order and also how much or how little we like those candidates. It's counted with just addition in 2 steps. So the 2 highest scoring candidates overall are your finalists, and then your one person, one vote automatically goes to the finalist you prefer. So even if your favorite turned out to not be electable, it's safe to vote your conscience. Your vote ultimately goes to that finalist that can win and represent you best. So there are a lot of advantages to it, and it really gets to some of the same inequalities that we see from gerrymandering or from the Electoral College. But the difference with voting method reform and also some of the other reforms that you're going to hear about tonight are that this is fully legal and viable all around the country. It's already constitutional, and there's no reason that we can't just start doing this at the local level, at the statewide level, or even at the federal level.
That was great, thank you. I'm going to start with a quote to just impart on you how important I think this topic is. And this is from George Washington, which is, I know, Matt Beat's favorite president, mine as well. And he says, "The power of the Constitution will always be in the people. It is entrusted for certain defined purposes and for a certain limited period to representatives of their own choosing. And whenever it is executed contrary to their interests or not agreeable to their wishes, their servants can and undoubtedly will be recalled or voted out of office. So I think this gets to the point that Sarah's making of how important it is that how we might recall or choose those who represent us. At the end of the day, George Washington believed that our First Amendment right to speak served the right to choose good representatives and to vote the bad ones out. Now, how do we reform the process? Sarah's given you a very important piece of the puzzle. I came to this problem from a different perspective. Originally, I was reading through my trusty Constitution, and I went through Article 1, okay, the legislature, Article 2, the president, Article 3, we've got the judiciary, and they keep getting shorter, and then I get to Article 5. And Article 5 presents a way for the Congress to present amendments to the states for ratification. And that's happened a number of times, over 20. The most recent amendment in 1992 actually was proposed all the way back in the 1700s. Along with that was another amendment we will be talking about. There's another way to propose and adopt amendments. That is a convention of the states. Some of you may have heard of this. And when I first came to this problem of how do we reform our system, I thought, a constitutional convention, this is the way. We're going to rally together and we'll get the states together and we're going to pass an amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, or we'll see what happens. And then I read a little closer. And what I read was the Congress, on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So ultimately, it's Congress that writes the rules at a convention of the states. And do we trust Congress today? About 20% of us do. So not very well. From there, I thought, okay, how are we going to do this? Well, I stumbled across that other amendment that I talked about. It was actually the first proposed amendment in what became our Bill of Rights. There were 12 amendments proposed, 10 passed originally, 1 passed in 1992, and there's another one sitting out there in the ether. It gave us a fundamental right to representation. Had it passed, we would today have approximately 7,000 representatives in the House. 7,000. That may seem like a tremendous number until you consider the number of federal executive bureaucrats and consultants in excess of 3 million who do the work delegated to them by our House. Now, as a result of that amendment not passing, due to a bug in the language of that amendment, in 1929, the House and the Senate decided to cap our representation at 435. So we have 435 representatives today, not because it's in the Constitution, not because of any reasoned analysis, but because that's what was politically feasible in 1929. Now, shortly thereafter, we got the New Deal. Our population has tripled. We've gotten the internet. And a host of other issues face us. Chief among them, I believe, is artificial intelligence. All it takes is a simple bill to repeal and replace the 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act, and the polarization that has fixated this country could shrivel up and coalesce around an educational institution known as representation. Coincidentally, that bill could also contain a provision that allows star voting. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution allows the Congress to set the methods by which voting occurs for its members. So we'll get in deeper, but that is my introduction.
Great introductions by both of you. Thank you. Yeah, we're off to a rolling start here. You mentioned the fact that 20% of people are fans of what Congress is doing. Yeah, those are more polls that show how frustrated most Americans are with Congress. Typically, there are polls like this, I think moldy bread polls higher than Congress or something like that. And we're going back and forth between how we are represented in Congress and how we pick the president, because as you can see on the screen, the numbers that determine the electoral votes, how many electoral votes a presidential candidate gets, are based mostly on representation. That's why, because most people live in California, in the United States, that's why they have 54 electoral votes. Texas, second largest state, 40 electoral votes. So this is, just briefly maybe, because I think you two are actually thinking beyond the Electoral College. But how can the Electoral College be reformed if we just keep it in place? Because in order to get rid of the Electoral College, you do need to amend the Constitution. That's 2/3 of Congress, that's 3/4 of the states, that's really difficult. So yeah, if we kept the Electoral College in place, how can it be reformed?
Yeah, so I'll just lead with saying that our nonprofit is explicitly nonpartisan, and I do think this is a nonpartisan issue. So the Electoral College is in many ways a compromise that was enacted to keep our country together. And there are strong arguments for why it should or shouldn't be reformed. But I will just say that every time the Electoral College has failed to elect, or maybe not every time, but two of the most notorious times that the Electoral College has failed to elect the winner of the popular vote, it hasn't just been the Electoral College that was at play there. There was vote splitting at play when Ralph Nader split the vote with Al Gore. And the same phenomena happened in reverse with Ross Perot splitting the vote from Bob Dole, who likely would have beat Clinton. So both political parties, both major parties, have lost the presidency in all likelihood because of vote splitting, which is the core problem that better voting methods like star voting, approval voting, or ranked robin, no matter what type of ballot you prefer, this is a fundamental flaw in our voting that can be solved.
Maybe explain vote splitting again, just like dumb it down for...
So vote splitting is really divided and conquered. I've got two great candidates on my side, and I've got a 60% majority, but 30% vote for one, 30% vote for the other, and the election goes to this 40% other side, who was actually opposed by a large majority. So you can get really unrepresentative outcomes, and it happens famously at the presidential level, but all the time in local elections around the country. So as to how to reform the Electoral College, short of repealing it, there's the National Interstate Compact, which is a really well-known thing where different states can all sign on, and if states representing a majority of electors end up signing on, then they would actually pledge a majority of votes to the winner of the popular vote. So that's a really creative workaround. There's also workarounds down the Interstate Compact. There's the Equal Citizens Initiative, which would get a red state and a blue state to both team up and say, we both together have 10 electors. Let's both of us pledge to proportionally delegate our electors. So instead of winner takes all, giving our state's electors to one side or the other, we could split them in according to the voters. And there's more options out there as well. I don't know if you want to add to that.
So basically, I think that we should reform the Electoral College by expanding the U.S. House of Representatives and thereby drastically increasing the number of electors. And so you basically reshape the map, and you also ensure that there are fewer of these swing states because you have more granularity looking at the population or being represented in the population. And I'll also just say I am not sure that the National Popular Vote Compact or Interstate Compact that's proposed, whether or not it would be constitutional. If you look at Article 1, which is about 8 pages in my Constitution, and then Article 2, which is about 4 pages, the first half of Article 2 is all about the Electoral College, and it's not clear to me that the proposal therein actually would pass muster. That would be for the Supreme Court to decide. And I guess my preference is the low-hanging fruit of a simple bill. So yeah.
There's another possible reform which currently the states of Maine and Nebraska do, which is they split up their electoral votes, and because different parts of the state vote differently. So for example, I used to live in Omaha, Nebraska, and that part of the state votes, they tend to vote more for Democrats there versus the rest of the state, which votes more for Republicans. And so if you look at a couple of recent elections, Omaha went blue and the rest of the state went red, and so the Democrats got, the Democratic candidate got at least one electoral vote. There are criticisms of that too. Basically, I've seen evidence that maybe it doesn't make that much of a difference in the end, but regardless, just know that there are these proposals for reforms. So, and thank you for sharing those. That one I didn't even know about. The one where the
Equal citizens.
the equal citizens. I hadn't even heard about that.
Yeah, it's kind of similar premise as the other one.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to. I guess let's talk about congressional districts first. So, congressional districts. A lot of people are frustrated with how they're drawn up. How can we reform congressional districts?
I'll let you go first on this one.
Sure. Make more of them is the first way to reform them. So if you were to drastically increase the number of representatives, you would drastically increase the number of congressional districts. Thereby, you would be redrawing them. And they would also be much harder to gerrymander. This is just a principle of mathematics. As something gets smaller, it is harder to draw it in quite as crazy of a shape for such long distances to capture small minority populations. The other, piece of this puzzle is the educational opportunity within those congressional districts. I look at congressional districts as educational opportunities, and right now they are not bidirectional educationally. There's really just Hollywood actors at play in our House of Representatives, and basically by making more of them and having them accountable to fewer people and having those people able to hold their representatives accountable, you change the shape or the nature of the race. It's less Hollywood and more actual people meeting at the grocery store, seeing the whites of each other's eyes, being able to tell, can I trust this human being or not? How do I rebuild that trust in another human being or in an institution to which that individual is a part of? And so, ultimately, the reform of congressional districts comes down, I believe, to their size, which dictates their shape. And to change that, you need to change the number. And so there are many proposals for what that should look like. It could be what's called the Wyoming rule. So you take the smallest state, Wyoming, where I live, and that is the denominator for the ratio. You could also take what many social scientists call the cube root rule, and you take the cube root of the population and you use that as the denominator. You could also use what was in our first proposed amendment, a straight ratio. They proposed 1 for 50,000, right? That's easy, simple math. Anyone can understand it. And there are other proposals, but those are kind of the major three of how we might get to reform of congressional districts.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add that reforming districting is really tricky. It's one of these things where you have a lot of competing but really important factors at play. Smaller districts have the advantage of making the representative more accessible to their voters. Ideally, they're in the community. They can even run for office with door knocking and a real grassroots campaign, really direct involvement that we want to see. But the smaller the districts are, the more gerrymandering can warp those. It's just more lines to have corrupt. And so there's a lot of talk about multi-member districts or larger districts as a way to kind of mitigate the effects of gerrymandering without addressing it directly. And yes, those can have a role to play and they can help in some ways. But there are also really fundamentally more direct ways to prevent and stop gerrymandering. So one thing about gerrymandering that's really important to remember is that it operates on a black and white binary. So red versus blue. In a two-party system, that's very easy to gerrymander. Racial gerrymandering, white versus non-white. But in a more nuanced spectrum, like an ideological spectrum or a multi-party system, that's actually a lot harder mathematically to gerrymander. And there are some really, really exciting proposals on the table. Gerrymandering in a polarized dynamic can actually be measured. So we can look at longitudinal data and say, over the last 10 years, there's this disparity where this side is really not getting a fair shake. And then we can redistrict according to that. So that's called efficiency gap. It's not a silver bullet. There's also compactness. You can look at how wonky is this octopus that you've drawn on the map, and cities like Austin, Texas are kind of a classic example of how districts can get really weird as politicians are choosing their voters instead of the other way around. But you can also do local districting methods like mapping on watersheds and mapping on fundamental core features of the landscape that unite and or divide unique communities from each other. So definitely a holistic approach is needed. It's not an easy nut to crack. It is solvable, and there are really a lot of advantages to, like you said, smaller districts. So I don't think saying, a lot of people will say, that can't be solved, so we just have to have huge districts. I disagree.
Yeah, I hate to do this, but like, just zooming out a little bit, just to review with those folks who are like, okay, they keep saying gerrymandering, let's review what that means. It means drawing up congressional districts in an arbitrary way, like a random way, and the whole point is the people that have power want to keep the power. And so they manipulate those districts in order to stay in power, or their political party to stay in power. The name comes from Elbridge Gerry, which the pronunciation got changed over the years, but Elbridge Gerry was a governor of Massachusetts who first got blamed for wanting to manipulate voting districts to benefit his political party. And that's where we get the name from, because the district they manipulated looked like a salamander. So Gary plus salamander equals gerrymander. So just want to make sure you know where that term comes from, because people are like, why do we call it gerrymandering? But yeah, and back to Walter's point, the average U.S. representative in this country right now serves approximately 785,000 constituents. So that's one person in the House that represents 785,000 people. Do you think they're knocking on all those 785,000 doors? No, they're not. So just kind of keep that in mind. I want to make sure that Sara has a chance to give her go deeper with voting reform. So let's go ahead and jump to what should we replace plurality voting with and why?
Okay. So
you ready for this?
Yeah, there are a number of voting methods out there. I, like most of us, thought that the choose one voting paradigm, where you have a primary and then a general election, was just the law of the land, and that's the way it is. I was really inspired to learn that there are other voting methods that have been proposed and that have been used around the world for thousands of years, hundreds of years. Like you said, our Constitution is totally open-ended about what is the best way to vote, and our founding fathers knew that this was an issue that was going to come down the pipe. So for people who like a really traditional-looking ballot, where you just have kind of one box next to each candidate, there's a system called approval voting, where you can just approve all the candidates that you like. So if there are a number of good options and a couple of awful ones, you're able to do that. Another option is using a score ballot, where you're scoring candidates, for example, 0 up to 5 stars. And that is a really elegant solution, because like I said before, it allows you to say, hey, my favorite is fabulous, I'm going to give them 5 stars. But there's actually another candidate who's just as fabulous. They actually have the same exact platform. They both have a great track record. I'm going to give them both 5 stars. And then this other person's pretty good too. I'll give them 4 stars. But I don't know if any of them can actually win. So maybe I'll give my lesser evil candidate 1 star and show that I really do at least prefer them over my worst case scenario. So that's really granular, it's really nuanced, it's really simple, and it turns out that humans have a nuanced opinion naturally. So allowing people to just put down their full honest opinion is a really natural way to vote. There's also ranked voting, which has gotten the majority of the airtime lately. Ranked choice voting is where you rank the candidates in order of preference, but you don't actually count all the rankings. So with ranked choice voting, your first choice is counted, votes are counted in elimination rounds where your vote transfers to your next choice if possible. But there are some scenarios where your vote might not be able to transfer. Your next choice might have already been eliminated or something like that. So it has now been banned widely. Ranked choice voting just hit 12 states that have banned ranked choice voting, and it also has some constitutional issues all around the country. I think it really won a lot of people's hearts with the pitch, and I think it was a good kind of introduction to voting reform for a lot of the country. But the idea behind all of these is really that I want to be able to vote my conscience. I want to be able to vote honestly and show my honest opinion on the candidates. I don't want my vote to be wasted. I don't want to have to worry about wasting my vote on a third party or on an independent. I don't want to have to worry about my vote getting lost in the shuffle or something like that. And third, we want our results to be accurate. We want accurate representative people who represent the voters. So that is really where I think star voting tops the charts. To just summarize one more time on star voting, you score your candidates from 0 up to 5 stars. The 2 highest scoring candidates overall are your finalists. And then you have an automatic runoff where you don't have to vote again. Your full vote automatically goes to the finalist you prefer, and the finalist with the most votes wins.
Really good explanations there. All promote consensus and coalitions is the point. We're not, all of them are, at least are trying to get rid of the polarization, the split voting. When you go to the grocery store, how many options do you have for toothpaste? You have like 25. You don't just have 2. People like choice.
And yeah, I guess I'll just do a quick shout out before we change the screen. St. Louis, Missouri uses approval voting for their local elections. And it's just a very popular, vetted way to do it, in which, if we're just trying to kind of stop the bleeding and get something that does actually guarantee an equal vote and that eliminates vote splitting and the spoiler problem, approval voting's the easy way to do it. So if I could snap my fingers today and just say all elections should be one way, it's such a small change that has no drawbacks. But a lot of people do want something more expressive. And I think in the type of world that we're trying to create, where we do have competitive elections with multiple parties, with multiple viable candidates able to step up and say, I want to serve, that's where we really want to be able to show a more nuanced opinion. How much or how little do we really like these people?
Raise your hand if you've never heard of star voting until today. There you go. All right, let's go back to the U.S. House of Representatives. So, Walter, how would expanding the size of, and try to be brief, I realize we're starting to run out of time, but how would expanding the size of the U.S. House of Representatives reform the presidency?
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. And I want to add one thing on Sarah's point about star voting. You have an unlimited number of stars. right? And I think this is important. I didn't get this at first. You have an unlimited number of stars. So you get to allocate 5 for all the candidates except for one, or just one. And so I want to add that. So as to how uncapping the House reforms the presidency or might curtail the power of the presidency. So the first way that it reforms the presidency is that it's going to better educate the people, right? And this is the fundamental point I want you to go home with, is that uncapping the House, enlarging the House of Representatives, it creates bidirectional educational pathways for people to educate their representatives instead of Hollywood stars, and for those people to build consensus about truths with their colleagues and then feed that back to the people. And I want to say this is so important that in my trusty Constitution here, the other quote by George Washington says as follows: "A primary object should be the education of our people in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important? And what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of our country?" Fundamentally, our problem today is an education issue, and representation solves that issue of education. It does so in part by bringing more experts into Congress. When was the last time you saw a welder as a congressional member? Any tradesman? Do any current Congress people actually know how to build a house? How about a jet? The next way it reforms the presidency is it restores power to impeachment. Impeachment is getting wagged around these days, and it is losing its power in part because it's a political tool that sucks the air out of the room. Bringing trustworthy people back into the House restores that important power, that important check. The next way is the power of the purse. The House has the duty to, among other things, impose tariffs. You may have heard a bit about that in the news lately. Now, Congress has delegated that power, in part, to the president. With more people in the House to oversee these issues, they once again could retake that power. The second to last point is that it breaks two-party control for a period of time in the House. Now, this may not last forever, but if you were to have a sufficient uncap or enlargement of the House, you would see independent and third-party candidates win races, and that is very important. And it's the reason that both parties are somewhat allergic to this idea at the moment. There are people within both parties who very much support this, but for this reason, there is a desire not to give away the power. So the last thing I want to give you is a visual model of what our government is trying to do. And we're in Kansas, and I know you love your vehicles because you have to drive everywhere, right? I'm from Texas originally, same thing. The way that our founders set up the Constitution was, imagine a truck pull. Trucks pulling in the opposite direction with a rope attached, and they're pulling in opposite directions, and they wanted that power to be balanced. But in our case, we actually have 3 vehicles pulling in 3 separate directions, okay? And when our country was founded, each of our vehicles had around 350 horsepower, right? Or you could say the Congress had around 350 horsepower. Maybe the executive branch was a little bit less powerful, and maybe the judiciary, as an afterthought, was the least powerful. Over time, the Congress has funded the executive branch to add a turbocharger and an intercooler and extra horsepower to the executive branch, all these extra people to do this work. And so what's happened is the executive branch is pulling us in whatever direction it wants. And so even if we increase the number of people in the House, say we add air to that engine, ultimately all we're doing is equalizing the horsepower, but we're way off in the wrong direction. Congress then would still have an enormous obligation to bring us back to the path where we started. And so just uncapping the House does not actually reduce the power of the presidency, does not actually reform the presidency, But an uncapped House has the capability to do so, freed of many of the problems that stifle congressional activity today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more power that Congress has, the less power the president has inevitably. So that's generally what I tell people when I'm trying to, especially sell it to somebody who's more conservative, because there's the Chevron case that went through last year. Well, do we want to even get into that? Do we have time?
Yeah,
Maybe just briefly mention that, like how if you're trying to pitch this to somebody who leans to the right politically, what would you say to them?
So one is oversight. That's where I got my start in this, right? If you have 435 people and there's approximately 6,000 or 7,000 staffers who are overseeing over 3 million people in the executive branch, it's an impossible task. I sat in a committee or a subcommittee with, I think there were 4 or 5 of us overseeing a $5 or $6 billion spend. It was a joke, right? We would just, pick a straw out of a hat or a name out of a hat. And I think, Matt, you're absolutely right to bring up the end of Chevron deference. The U.S. Supreme Court, who in Marbury versus Madison asserted their power, right? They're a very powerful entity in this tug of war between the branches. They recently have passed, or they issued an order, Loper Bright v. Raimondo, that was 2024, SEC versus Jarsky, and Corner Post versus Board of Governors, and then all the way back in 2022, West Virginia versus EPA. These 4 cases, all of them, what the Supreme Court is saying is basically the executive branch has been given too much authority that is unconstitutional, right? The imbalance is so palpable that the Supreme Court has said, we need this power back in Congress. The problem is Congress doesn't have the manpower to shoulder that burden. And so everyone in D.C. is left wondering, what are we going to do? And the answer is, we need more members in the House.
So one interesting thing that blew my mind when I learned it, in terms of just civic facts with these 3 branches of government, judicial, executive, legislative, is that the voters are actually the legislative branch as well. Mm-hmm. And because this is a representative democracy / republic, the voters are really delegating their authority to make these policy decisions to their representatives. And so that's where it really, to me, all comes back to ensuring that the voters have the leverage they need to be able to hold their politicians accountable and either vote people in who have that leadership skill set that we want to see in the executive branch, or to vote people out if they say they're going to do one thing and then they do what the lobbyists told them instead. So with the current system, and why I keep hammering on this vote splitting spoiler effect root problem, the issue there is the electability bias. Currently, if I want to vote for somebody, I have this huge strategic calculation that I need to do. I need to say, which of these candidates are electable? Which ones are electable on the opposite side? Which are electable on my side? And if you don't vote for the front runner on your side who you think can win, then you risk wasting your vote. And so who does that give the power to? People with the best name recognition. Overwhelmingly, people who have the most money in the race. And of course, our incumbents. And our incumbents are overwhelmingly much, much older than our average voter. They're definitely demographically not representative in an equitable sort of way. And so I really strongly believe that just empowering voters to vote their conscience is at the root of solving all of these problems. And at some point, there's kind of an order of operations thing where, like I said, electoral reform is a big puzzle. There are a lot of really important pieces. Certainly changing to a 5-star ballot or even an approval ballot isn't gonna solve it all or even do that much. But what it can do is it can break 2-party domination. All around the world, countries that use choose one only voting, where you vote for one candidate only, you vote for the front runner who seems electable on your side, those countries end up in a two-party polarized dynamic, and that polarization over time gets more and more extreme as voters get more and more strategic and candidates get more strategic, trying to represent one side or the other instead of trying to represent the middle. And candidates who do run from the middle in our current system are at a mathematical disadvantage. They have to compete with people on the left, and they have to compete with people on the right. So for candidates, there's a huge incentive for them to, try and diversify so that they don't end up like having the same message as somebody else and splitting the vote there. But be polarizing, be on one side or the other so that you don't get in that middle position where you're having to compete with attacks from both sides. And that's really harmful, in terms of representative policy. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're only going to get one piece of legislation or one set of policy on each issue passed. And if we have those consensus decisions being made, then we won't see these dramatic swings where under one administration, we spend the first 4 years just undoing everything that the previous administration did and then do it all again in the next 4-year cycle.
And unfortunately, we're almost out of time here, so I'll ask one more question here. But before that, if you want to ask us a question online, if you're watching the live stream, send an email to dolequestions@ku.edu. That's dolequestions@ku.edu, and we'll be checking that. And then after we're done here, we'll open it up to the audience, a Q&A. So just a reminder on that, if you have a question, raise your hand. A student worker will come over and give you the microphone, and wait for the microphone before you start speaking. But yeah, I put up a map there just to show, I know Sara was mentioning earlier that already we've seen many states not only implement ranked choice voting, but some states have banned it. So yeah, freedom. So I guess this is the one that most of you are already familiar with. So my final question for Sara is, and feel free to sneak anything else in here you want to sneak in, because we didn't get to open primaries.
There's so much.
Promotion, yeah, a bunch of stuff. But yeah, like at the local level, what efforts are happening right now to get to implement star voting? And you mentioned St. Louis with approval voting, but where else is
Yeah,
stuff
so the first jurisdictions in the country, or really in the world, to implement a voting method that really gives every voter mathematical equality, that was approval voting. And Fargo, North Dakota did it first. St. Louis, Missouri was second. And we now are seeing a national movement for approval voting as just a really simple upgrade that ensures more consensus winners. Star voting has really caught on as kind of the successor to the ranked choice voting movement, where it delivers on all the goals of the ranked choice community, but also addresses a lot of key issues that really should be solved. So, so how many people in this room are a fan of ranked choice voting? We got some people. Okay. So one of the things that we don't like about it is that it can ignore a really large percentage of the ballot data. And the fact that it doesn't actually count all the rankings is sort of a workaround that made it easier to hand count 150 years ago when it was first invented, but that is really not serving us anymore. So that's one of the reasons it's been really hard hit over backlash around wasted votes, ignored ballot data, and also election security issues, because when you're not counting all of the data, that's much more complicated. So we have had a couple of elections in California and in New York where ranked choice elections were mistallied, and they actually put out the wrong election results. So with all of the voting methods that the Equal Vote Coalition recommends, whether it's a ranked ballot, a traditional looking ballot, or a 5-star ballot, you're counting all of that ballot data it's fully compatible with election security and election integrity best practices. There's no centralization of the ballots or anything like that. It's all just addition. And all of them top the charts in terms of representative winners. So definitely be open-minded. It's not necessarily about the brand, it's about delivering the results that people really want.
And I want to give Walter one more chance here. Like, if you could be brief, like your last pitch for your reforms that you prioritize right now. And I remember to put up the graphics there.
Our
And I guess-
country, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just forgot one thing. But
Yeah,
to
go
get
ahead.
involved, please get involved. Equal.vote is our website. We're volunteer driven. We have chapters all around the country who are working on this and other issues and that are coalitioning with electoral reformers in their states and in their cities to put together the different pieces of the puzzle and attack it at every stage.
And it starts at the local level. That's the most important takeaway, I think. Like, we can start here in Lawrence, here in Kansas. That's where we can start the reform. Go ahead, Walter.
Yeah, I think as you can see from the graph on the left, our house has flatlined. It's dying, perhaps dead. But it can be revived. There are paddles waiting, and it does take you to show up, put your money out there, your voice, your concern, share this with your friends and family. The most important point, I think, today is that both of the things that we're talking about are bipartisan or nonpartisan. It is a great way to de-escalate any difficult political conversation that you may be having in the next year. Somebody is upset with what's going on. I understand the problems are real. Here's a solution. Here are two solutions. So please take these solutions. Go check out what Sara's doing. Please go to nocapfund.org as well. Look at what we're doing. Take the pledge. We need to save our country. We are in crisis. And there's a clear reason why, I believe. The solution is each of you. So thank you for being here, being the people who are educating themselves. The future is in your hands.
Yeah, let's give them a round of applause, both of them. Thank you for being here. Yeah, you should run for president. No, that's good, that's good. He actually did run for president. Okay, so as you can tell, all of us on stage here are passionate about this stuff. We could go on for hours about this. All of us believe that every reform starts with voting reform. So if you want to, if your priority is like, gun regulations or housing or healthcare, guess what? It goes back to voting first. Then we can talk about those other reforms later. So maybe with that on your mind, we're going to open it up for questions now. So again, if you have a question, raise your hand and someone will come around with a microphone.
What can Americans do to get the reforms they want actually passed? And could we take lessons out of the playbook of past activists in American history with that goal in mind?
Yeah. So I personally, and the reason that I chose to work on voting reform and star voting is that I think it's the most doable of all of the electoral reforms. And, a lot of people are really drawn to these sexy electoral reforms, like combat big money in politics. Like
And Citizens United, yeah.
That polls at like 99%, or 95 in a lot of places. But politicians don't want to give up their power. And so as a order of operations, I do think it's really important to, step one, empower the voters to hold politicians accountable, and that is with a better voting method first. And then once you've done that, all of these pie-in-the-sky ideas that require a constitutional convention or that require politicians to actually be on board with doing their jobs, are totally doable because we'll have better politicians in office. And there is no shortage of talent. We're, in many would say the greatest country in the world. We have bright and brilliant minds. We have a wealth of experience. We also have the enthusiasm of being a young and a new country that has a history of pioneering in democracy itself. I think we started that movement. And so, from the bottom up, if we empower the people, I think all the rest is on the table.
Yeah, I would just add, organize. Go to Sara's website, sign up, find your local chapter. The other thing I'll add is do actually call your representative, send them an email. Although you are grossly underrepresented, it does still sometimes work, especially if you can get, thousands of people in your community to do so. That requires local organization, but we can help you do that. And so if you're interested in putting in that type of sweat equity, there are tools available and we can put them in your hands.
Every national movement started out local. So I think about the women's rights movement of the mid-1800s, upstate New York, Seneca Falls Convention, that started out as a local thing. The civil rights movement started out in just places like Montgomery, Alabama, or Atlanta, Georgia, Baltimore, Maryland, and then they all oh, you're doing the same thing we are? Well, let's just join forces. But I think it's really important to begin local because you know your neighbors. Although increasingly we can have another conversation about how we don't know our neighbors as much as we used to, but I digress. But yeah, talk to your neighbors.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add, you can definitely try different voting methods online. So if you have a book club or you have a local political civic movement or you have a League of Women Voters chapter or something, go to bettervoting.com, and we have a slick new web app that allows you to pick your voting method, to try it out, to let your voters try it out. A lot of this is just fear of change. So getting better voting methods used at the nonprofit level and the NGO level and at the in the private sector or for hiring committees, all of that has a huge impact. So, yeah.
Hi. I can really see how some of your alternative voting methods would work well in nonpartisan elections, like school board elections or something. But is there any way to do that, like on a national level, without just doing away with the two-party system?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're actually not, definitely not anti any party. Ideally, with better voting, we would have the same parties, but better and more of them. So in Oregon, where I'm from, we had a statewide ballot initiative last cycle and likely will again. Oregon has nonpartisan elections for our local races. And the proposal there was that we would have all the candidates on one ballot. If there were 5 or more candidates, you would have a unified primary where everyone votes, and the top best 5 candidates advance to the general election. In the general election, you vote again using star voting, and you get a winner. But the same exact concept works for partisan elections too, which in Oregon are all of our statewide and federal races. So you would have the party primaries as a default. Those would each use a better voting method like star voting. And then each party would advance somebody who actually better represents their party. Because we've seen Republican primaries with 20 candidates where vote splitting is a huge problem, or Democratic Party primaries where vote splitting is a huge problem. And then again, we would have a general election with all of the different parties: Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green, Libertarian, and so on, Forward Party. So one of the things I love about these voting reforms is that they're so adaptable. Different states have different systems, and no matter what you do with all of these other electoral reforms, this is something that's just viable, it's on the table, And you can do it at every level, and it'll have an impact at every level.
Walter, want to chime in, or?
No, let's go to the next question.
I was going to say, that was pretty good.
Yep.
I understand the president has put out an executive order asking the states to turn over voter information. What would the implications of that be for us?
Just gonna say, I love the secret ballot.
Yeah, the secret ballot wasn't always around either. We take it for granted, but it wasn't always around. Go ahead.
I don't know that I wasn't familiar with that executive order prior to now, so I don't know that I have any sophisticated thoughts on the implications other than we haven't had a constitutional amendment since the invention of the internet, and all of your data is for sale to China, but also to various federal agencies within our own government. And I think privacy is an enormous issue that we haven't grappled with as a nation. And in order to do so, we probably need a constitutional amendment. And before we can get to a constitutional amendment, we probably want a Congress we can trust. So always back to uncapping the House.
Always back to voting reforms and representation reforms.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. What's it at time?
Since the population has tripled, where are you going to put the other 870 representatives?
Good question.
Great question. So there are a couple options here. One is that there actually is there's a great piece in an op-ed in the New York Times. They hired an architect, and you can fit, I think, 1,200 people in the current house with simple architectural revisions. Additionally, it appears that the current administration is pretty keen on getting rid of a bunch of executive agencies and the people that occupy those buildings. So there might be more space there. Thirdly, we could just add on to the House. We're pretty good at building things. Our current president loves building things, I think. So maybe he would want to, build an addition. The last thing is, I'll go back to the internet. I think that we are at a time and place where our representatives can and should spend most of their time in their home districts, overseeing the vast parts of the federal bureaucracy that exist within our states, not in D.C. That removes them from some of the lobbying influences, and it also reduces the need for the staff in D.C. They spend time in their home districts, meeting you at the grocery store while out doing regular human things.
And I guess one of the things that you said earlier when we were talking is about how currently the legislative branch really just doesn't have the bandwidth to tackle every little thing in detail. So they delegate a lot of that to people who've been hired to do so, particularly in the executive branch side. But your idea isn't necessarily that government would be bigger, it's just that more of those people would be elected. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is a really important point for what is going on right now with DOGE and the Trump administration. One of their key problems in the unitary executive theory that is, I think, being pushed forward by the Trump administration is, we have all these civil servants who aren't terminable at will, right? We can't just fire them. There are all these inferior officer protections. And so if you moved some of that expertise from the executive branch to the legislative branch, you retain that expertise, you don't lose it, but you make it so that if they start misbehaving, they can be fired a little bit more easily and more directly connected to the representatives who oversee them, and hence you, who might have an interest in what they're actually doing. And those people would obviously, or could be tied more directly to issues in your hometown. Frankly, in Wyoming, we don't really care what the Coastal Conservation Association is doing with permitting wells, off the coast of Texas so much as Texas does, or Florida. So you create a little bit more, I think, regional variability in where that expertise might lie.
Yeah, the trend has been throughout American history, we've become much more nationalized, and I don't think it's brought up enough that one reason is because of that disconnect between Congress and constituents, because I mean, they're out of touch because they're never here. They're never in their home districts or states. And yeah, like you're saying, every state has different issues that they prioritize, and if you only have so much staff, then you don't really know what to focus on, and so, yeah, they need help.
Well, one last point that I've talked with other congressional staffers about is the opportunity for staffers to actually be embedded in agencies rather than, so a lot of the way oversight is conducted today, you send a letter to the FDA, dear Mr. Head of the FDA, could you please come and answer some questions? And they send a staffer and very few documents that you've requested. If congressional staffers were actually inside those buildings overseeing potentially, you would get rid of a lot of that red tape because you know where the closet is, where the document is, and you actually know the people, right? You've built trust in between humans in the various branches so that you have a much better sense of where is the knowledge that I'm seeking.
And you wouldn't have as many Hollywood congressional hearings, am I right? We don't have to put on a show like confrontations and congressional hearings when it's really like, what is the purpose for this other than a show?
Right.
Okay, we have time for, oh yeah, we have time. Yeah, let's get another question. How about it?
I would like to ask my question to all three of you. And my question is, what would you consider the most important thing to remember when you're trying to energize the 16 to 25 age group to get involved in civics, to get involved in politics, to the point where they would actually register to vote, and more importantly, to vote?
Your most fundamental right is your freedom, the free expression of your will as a human being, as a creature that has thoughts that are unique to you. And those freedoms are enshrined in our First Amendment. Your freedom to speak, to assemble, to petition for a redress of grievances, to have a religion. None of that matters unless you have representatives who fundamentally protect that right. George Washington vehemently believed, it was the only time he spoke on substance in the constitutional debates, was for more representation. The only time he spoke was for more representation. So if you care about freedom in any sense, your freedom to speak is only protected by those you elect through voting. So you have to get out. You have to protect that right through representation with your vote. And if you don't, they will take it away.
Yeah, I'll say as a young person getting involved in voting for the first time, there was really a lot of sentiment, and I'm 41 now, but at the time, that, my vote's not going to make a difference. It's not safe to vote my conscience anyway. Like, why would I bother to learn about all of these candidates when, it's all kind of decided by the money and the lobbyists and this machine that I have no control over? So if we want to engage voters and reinvigorate both parties, all parties, we need to have systems that actually listen to the people. Is it even a democracy if it's not safe to vote your conscience without worrying about your vote having unintended consequences? We really need to empower the people. And I think if we empower the people, then we will inspire the people. And if we inspire the people and empower them, we won't have to have giant protests. We'll be able to have more nuanced conversation, frankly. The kind of thing that doesn't fit on a billboard or on a sign. There are a lot of conversations right now where we need to stop talking about anti the other side, and we need to start talking about more nuanced views on more nuanced issues. So that's the type of thing that we can do. It takes a little more time. It invites a little bit more from voters, and they're willing to do it. People have strong opinions, but they want those opinions to make a difference. So give the people what we want, you know. A lot of people say, it's your civic duty, just vote, you know, and it's kind of like blaming the victim instead of blaming the system. It's like, no, people aren't voting because the system is broken. Let's actually address their valid concerns, and we will see people turning out in droves and a lot happier with the representation we get that way.
Could I add one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I was talking to a 16 to 20-year-old, what I would say is, if you don't fix this, the robots are probably going to come and take you and kill you.
Yeah.
I mean,
They're coming.
you know, short and sweet. I mean, the AI, the robots, they are coming to fundamentally disrupt everything about our civilization. And if you don't have representation to sift through the mess, they're going to take over. They're going to win, or whoever owns the robots are going to win. So
That certainly gets their attention. I taught middle school and high school social studies for 12 years, and most of my audience is under 40 on YouTube. So I think about this all the time. And I think we just need to always remember, we need to come back to what is the purpose of government. Primarily, it's to protect us. It's to protect us so that we have the freedom to do stuff that we want to do. And we also have the freedom from stuff that would hurt us. So freedom to, freedom from, government's there to protect us. Well, that can mean a lot of different things. And so you still might not have that 16-year-old attention. So then you say, okay, do you like money? Because, like, I know I first got into politics. I'm spitting, I'm so enthusiastic about this stuff. Okay, I first got into politics when I looked at my first paycheck, when I was like, where did that money go? What are they doing with this money? Like, they just stole my money? And if you follow the money and you're like, I don't like how that's being spent now, I think that's a really easy way to get young people into it, because a lot of them are already working and have to pay income taxes, and say, oh, I don't pay taxes. Yeah, you do. Have you ever bought anything? Oh, yeah. It's the same thing like people say, oh, immigrants or illegal immigrants don't pay taxes. Oh my gosh. They buy stuff. Okay, sorry. We'll end it there, I think. We're past time. So in conclusion, I would like to thank the Dole Institute. I'd like to thank Jacob and Braden and Nathan, Sarah, Stacy, and finally Audrey Coleman for allowing me to be a fellow for this program. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you to all my guests. And yeah, we'll let Audrey wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Thank you all for being here with us this afternoon for really our discussion group conclusion this semester, and it was a great finale. So Matt Beat, thank you so much for being our fellow this semester. You've really introduced us to many new audiences. You're our first fellow whose primary communication medium is YouTube, and you've expanded our audience in person and online. So that's just been fantastic, and your programs have been educational. And Sara and Walter, thank you so much for traveling here and being a part of this important conversation, and invigorating and inspiring here, particularly at conclusion. So thank you so much. As you've said, our first step is showing up and then educating yourself, and that's exactly what we're all doing here this afternoon. 2 public service announcements before I let you go. Next week, on Wednesday, April 16th, is the annual Dole Lecture. Our guests will be former Dole staff leadership, Sheila Burke, Rod DeArmond, and Bob Lighthizer. They'll be here talking about economic policy and political development from 1980 until 1996, and Bob Dole's leadership during that time. You won't want to miss that. Very interesting to have that discussion as time marches on, and we can assess over time. April 30th here at the Dole Institute at 7:00 p.m. We'll be partnering with our friends at the National Defense Initiatives at the University of Kansas to host their keynote event. We will have our visiting fellow Jerry Seib, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, back to interview former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Those of you who remember, Bob Gates was appointed by George W. Bush and then later served for President Obama. So some good bipartisan messaging there. They're going to be talking about China's geopolitical strategy and what we might expect in national security in that regard. So we hope to see you again at least 2 times more this month. I should mention too, you'll see advertised on our screen, April 19th is our annual Easter egg roll. If you've got kiddos in your life, bring them here to the Dole Institute between 10 and 1 o'clock. That's Saturday before Easter. And we just have a really great time celebrating in our own White House style Easter egg roll. So have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.